In the cramped dark of a coral bunker, a single blast at point-blank range changed the tempo of an assault. February 1942 through September 1944, Solomon Islands, Central Pacific. United States Marine Corps and United States Army assault units versus Imperial Japanese garrison forces. The central question is tactical. How did the 12-gauge shotgun become a practical solution for clearing enclosed defensive positions on Pacific Islands, and why did Japanese defenders repeatedly describe encounters with it as different from ordinary rifle fire? Amphibious operations delivered attackers into dense, confined terrain. Coral ridgelines, slit trenches, caves, and tightly packed hut compounds. Defenders used narrow approaches, interlocking fields of fire, and prepared strong points that limited sightlines and created lethal close angles. Under those conditions, aimed rifle fire often proved impractical. Hand grenades required a close approach and posed a risk to nearby friendly troops. Assault commanders faced a binary choice between slow, methodical clearing that increased exposure and rapid, risky entry that raised fratricide. The shotgun offered a third option. Short-barreled shotguns were already present aboard transports and landing craft for routine shipboard tasks. Field improvisation turned these implements into combat tools by pairing them with buckshot breaching loads and shortened barrels. Mechanically, a buckshot load disperses multiple pellets within a confined cone at 2 to 5 meters. That dispersion increased hit probability where precise aim was impossible and concentrated lethality on the immediate space while reducing the lethal corridor beyond the breach. In practice, this meant an entry team could neutralize a doorway or slit trench with less time exposed in the kill zone. Unit notes and company after-action reports from island operations record repeated instances where shotgun employment shortened clearing time or forced defenders to withdraw from positions that had resisted rifle and grenade assaults. Training memos and late 1944 assault circulars began to codify mixed armament teams that paired riflemen, submachine gunners, grenadiers, and designated shotgun men for breach tasks. The archival trail links improvisation to measured doctrinal change. This opening will proceed by establishing a brief timeline of early 1942 tests documented in field notes. Then, by examining operational examples such as Tarawa and Peleliu, where close clearing dominated combat. And finally, by reviewing contemporaneous evaluations that revised small unit assault technique. The claim is narrow. The shotgun altered the microdynamics of entry and reduced exposure time for assault teams. It did not replace naval gunfire, air support, or logistics as determinants of campaign outcomes. February 1942, the Central Pacific Island campaigns exposed a persistent, repeating tactical problem. Assault teams routinely fought inside spaces where conventional standoff firepower had little purchase. Coral ridgelines, slit trenches, caves, and compact hut compounds created lethal short-range geometries. Defenders exploited narrow approaches, interlocking fields of fire, and layered fallback positions that turned every doorway and slit into a choke point. Under those physical constraints, aimed rifle fire often failed to guarantee immediate neutralization of a threat at point-blank ranges. Amphibious sequencing amplified the problem. Landings followed a fragile timetable. Delays in clearing a single strongpoint could stall a beachhead and expose follow-on waves to concentrated flanking or plunging fire. Commanders therefore faced a harsh operational calculus: clear slowly and accept prolonged exposure, or push fast and accept higher risk of fratricide. That time-pressure dynamic created demand for a close-in tool that shortened the interval between detection and incapacitation inside confined spaces. Material availability made the 12-gauge shotgun a plausible candidate. Short-barreled shotguns already existed aboard transports, landing craft, and in depot stocks for routine guard and shipboard duties. Serviceable trench and riot gun patterns, such as the Winchester Model 1897 and pump-action designs, were durable and familiar to ordnance crews. Because these weapons were physically on-hand, units could requisition and modify them rapidly, shortening barrels, adding ventilated handguards, and provisioning appropriate shells without waiting for new issue systems from rear echelon depots. In short, logistics favored adaptation of existing material over delayed procurement of novel small arms. Ballistics and munition characteristics matched the mission profile. A typical 12-gauge buckshot load disperses multiple pellets in a cone at distances of roughly 2 to 5 meters. In confined spaces, that dispersion increases the probability of at least one effective hit, where a single aimed rifle shot might miss entirely behind clutter or at an oblique angle. Conversely, the shotgun's energy profile falls off quickly beyond short ranges, which limits dangerous over-penetration downrange. This combination, high near-probability lethality with reduced lethal depth, fits the clearance task incapacitate occupants of a doorway or slit trench, while reducing the creation of an extended lethal corridor that endangers teammates. Field experience exposed practical limits that shaped employment. Tropical humidity and salt spray degraded wooden stocks and swelled paper hull shells. Brass-cased military loads improved reliability but competed with scarce ordnance resources. Ammunition bulk and weight constrained how many buckshot rounds escorting units could carry on repeated assaults. Maintenance demands and the need for regular cleaning in a corrosive environment increased administrative overhead. Commanders therefore rationed shotgun use for decisive breach moments rather than for continuous suppressive fire. Tactical employment emerged by iterative trial and correction. Small units improvised entry teams that paired one or two designated shotgun men with riflemen, submachine gunners, and grenadiers. Rehearsed entry rhythms grenade, then immediate shotgun sweep reduced time spent inside the attacker's most vulnerable interval. Placement rules evolved. Shotgun men typically took the flank least likely to intersect friendly lines of fire and were practiced to fire only on clear arc conformation to minimize fratricide. After-action reports and company diaries record these practices as repeated field fixes rather than as isolated innovations. Institutional uptake followed a bottom-up path. Training officers aggregated unit observations into consolidated notes and recommendations. By late 1944, some assault circulars and regimental training materials reflected mixed armament entry tables that explicitly listed shotgun men alongside riflemen and submachine gunners for bunker and cave clearing. The doctrinal change therefore reads as incremental institutionalization of a successful field expedient, not as a doctrinal imposition from distant headquarters. Opposition reaction constituted an important causal feedback. Interrogations translated battlefield testimony and intelligence summaries occasionally recorded language indicating surprise or disorientation among Japanese defenders when faced with sudden multi-pellet wounds at close range. Those psychological effects did not collapse defensive doctrine, but they did modify local decision cycles. Defenders who expected conventional mid-range rifle duels encountered an unfamiliar hazard that increased the perceived risk of holding narrow apertures. The cumulative effect of repeated localized shock influenced some defensive dispositions and withdrawal decisions. Command calculus weighed reward against cost. The operational reward included reduced exposure time, faster clearing of critical apertures, and in some recorded instances, lower short-term friendly casualties during specific breach actions. The principal costs were ammunition consumption, maintenance burdens, and elevated fratricide risk without disciplined drill. Where confined geometry and tempo justified the expenditure, commanders allocated shotgun men to entry teams. Where open terrain or prolonged suppression were required, rifles and automatic weapons remained primary. In sum, the causes and build-up that brought the 12-gauge shotgun into repeated use for Pacific Island clearing were multifactorial. Environmental constraints and Japanese defensive engineering created a recurring tactical friction. Existing stocks of robust shotguns and readily available ammunition provided an expedient tool. The shotgun's ballistic profile matched the close-in clearance mission, and iterative field experiments combined with measured doctrinal updates institutionalized mixed armament entry practices. The next segment will trace how these elements played out in opening moves on specific islands where close clearing dominated the fighting. Landing craft ground on coral approaches, men hit the water with packs and weapons. The initial seconds defined the rhythm of the assault. Commanders had planned for suppression, and movement. The reality on the reef and in the lanes forced small units into immediate close contact fights. In these opening moves, the problem was not who had the heavier weapons, but who could clear narrow apertures quickly enough to let follow forces pass. On Betio Island, Tarawa, November 1943, the coral rim and narrow causeways concentrated movement into predictable lanes. Assault waves could not spread out. A single defended revetment became a choke that halted an entire company. Platoon leaders reported that once attackers reached the coral interior, they confronted slit trenches, bunk openings, and interstitial cover where accurate aimed shots were difficult and where grenades were the primary option for clearance. Those grenades required proximity and risked injuring nearby teammates. The immediate tactical answer on many of these first moves was improvisation. Designate a man with a short-barreled shotgun to the entry sequence and rehearse the coordination with grenadiers and submachine gunners. The entry template that emerged in opening moves was compact and repeatable. First, suppressive fire pinned heads down outside the aperture. Second, a grenadier tossed a fragmentation charge to unsettle defenders or to finish a hiding spot. Third, a designated shotgun man executed an immediate point-blank sweep into the doorway or trench. Fourth, riflemen and submachine gunners poured controlled sweeping fire to secure the flanks while the assault team pushed through. This sequence reduced the time the team spent clustered at the breach point and increased the odds the first volley would incapacitate defenders rather than merely wound or frighten them. Logistics and human factors shaped how many shotgun men appeared in a formation. Commanders rarely assigned more than 1 or 2 per entry team because ammunition was bulky and because the shotgun's utility peaked at extreme close range. A standard entry team therefore mixed roles deliberately. A rifleman provided outward security. An automatic weaponer offered suppressive continuity. A grenade specialist broke confinement. And the shotgun man functioned as the rapid area neutralizer inside the doorway. Where the terrain produced multiple adjacent apertures, teams rehearsed sequencing so that shotgun arcs did not intersect friendly fields of fire. Initial orders reflected both doctrine and improvisation. Regimental and company-level standing orders for amphibious assault emphasized the need to clear revetments and pillboxes quickly and to maintain beachhead momentum. In practice, those orders evolved at the platoon level as contacts occurred. Junior officers and NCOs who had seen quick clearing with a shotgun in one engagement added the method to their standard entry sequence. After action notes repeated these adaptations and training officers incorporated successful patterns into subsequent rehearsals. The opening moves therefore show a rapid feedback loop from combat experience back into small unit practice. Environmental details in these first encounters mattered. Darkness, smoke, and the static noise of bombardment complicated aim and made muzzle flash a hazard. In a smoke-filled hut or a dim trench, the shotgun's pellet spread reduced the need for a perfect sight picture. That mechanical advantage was decisive in rooms and narrow passageways where an attacker could not present a flank without exposing his comrades. Conversely, during daylight in open approaches, the shotgun offered little benefit. Its role was strictly confined to enclosed geometries. At Peleliu, September 1944, the island's cave systems added a different dimension. Entrances were narrow. Defenders could shepherd an attacker into a single killing field. Assault teams found that clearing a cave mouth with rifle fire alone often failed because of internal angles and dead space. Combined use of grenades to clear the entrance and shotgun sweeps to finish interior points proved effective in several tactical episodes. Teams that used this hybrid method reported faster clearance and fewer occasions where defenders remained in defended recesses after initial suppression. Opening moves also depended on communication discipline. Shooters and grenadiers timed their actions to radio intervals and hand signals. A single miscue, a premature shotgun blast, or an untimely grenade could cause friendly casualties. Units that rehearsed entry timing in shipboard mock-ups and on landing beaches showed markedly fewer fratricide incidents when they executed the grenadier then shotgun rhythm. The rehearsal practice therefore became part of the opening move doctrine: brief the sequence walk, the lanes on the beach, and assign arcs. Enemy reaction in the opening minutes deserves emphasis. Defenders accustomed to countering rifle and machine gun suppressive patterns had limited time to adapt to a sudden multi-pellet hazard inside a confined aperture. Translated interrogations and battlefield summaries sometimes recorded immediate withdrawal from narrow slits after an entry where shotgun sweeps occurred. That withdrawal did not always signify rout. Rather, it changed the defender's short-term calculus: hold the aperture or fall back to a prepared secondary position. The result for attackers was often a win. The objective opened and follow-on forces could pass through the breach without becoming bottlenecked. Tactical chaining magnified the opening move effect. A cleared aperture allowed engineers to move quickly to remove obstacles and to permit heavier weapons to position. That sequence accelerated consolidation of the foothold and reduced the time defenders had to organize counterattacks from secondary positions. Small successes in these opening moves therefore had outsized operational value because they preserved tempo and maintained the offensive initiative at the beachhead. There were notable failures and risks in these first sequences. Units that lacked coordination fired too many shotgun rounds into ambiguous spaces and produced fratricide. Ammunition shortages sometimes meant that shotgun rounds were saved for later stages of an operation, negating their immediate utility. And in a few documented episodes, the shotgun's limited range forced teams into closer proximity than prudence warranted, exposing them to hand-thrown charges and close-quarters melee. Commanders balanced these downsides against the clear tactical benefit in confined clearing tasks. Training and institutional response followed the early actions. Units that had success integrated shotgun employment into pre-invasion rehearsals and into the landing plans checklists. Ordnance officers standardized short-barrel modifications and handguards. Quartermaster procedures adjusted to include a modest allotment of buckshot for assault waves. Those administrative changes reduced friction and allowed opening move templates to be replicated with greater reliability across successive operations. In conclusion, the opening moves across the Central Pacific show a repeated pattern-tight terrain, and time pressure created a demand for immediate close-range neutralization. Available shotguns supplied a pragmatic answer. Disciplined entry sequencing suppression grenades shotgun sweep, then flank security reduced exposure time, and successful patterns were quickly absorbed into training and planning. Where these elements aligned, the assault team moved faster and with fewer immediate losses. Where they failed, the beachhead risked delay and heavier casualties. The next section will examine the decisive actions that turned isolated tactical successes into campaign-level consequences and will assess a few detailed case studies that illustrate both the technique and its limits. November 1943. Tarawa, the first brutal proof, came not from a single grand maneuver, but from a repeated micro-decision at the breach. Assault waves reached the coral rim and confronted revetments that halted movement and concentrated enemy fire. In those moments, a single disciplined entry sequence could determine whether an aperture opened or an entire company became immobile. The turning point at the tactical level was therefore procedural, the adoption of a combined grenade and shotgun sweep as the decisive means to collapse defended apertures quickly enough to preserve beachhead momentum. The decisive action unfolded as a sequence of command choices executed under acute time pressure. Company and platoon leaders who had seen ad hoc shotgun employment in earlier contacts formalized the sequence for specific beaches and approach lanes. The order was intentionally simple to minimize error-suppressive fire to pin heads down, immediate fragmentation to disorient inside the aperture, then a point-blank shotgun sweep to neutralize any remaining resistance, finally controlled follow-through by riflemen and automatic weapons to secure the interior. That order mattered because it compressed the decision cycle inside the most dangerous interval, the few seconds when attackers and defenders occupied the same limited geometry. A turning point is rarely a single shot. It is the cumulative effect of doctrine meeting space and logistics. Mechanically, the shotgun solved three immediate problems in that decisive sequence. First, it increased hit probability, where clutter and angles made sighting with a rifle unreliable. Second, its rapid energy fall-off reduced the danger that a penetrating round would travel through the breach and injure follow forces. Third, its spread allowed a point-blank sweep to cover multiple hiding loci at once doorways, floor recesses, and the shoulders of bunk ports. Those three mechanical attributes combined to shorten the time an assault team spent clustered at the breach and thus to reduce exposure to enemy fire concentrated on the aperture. Timing and command latency were critical. A brief delay between grenade detonation and shotgun sweep could allow a defender to reorient or to explode an improvised countermeasure. Conversely, a shotgun sweep executed too soon risked violating arcs of friendly fire or scattering fragments that interfered with grenade effects. The decisive act therefore depended on training and communication, rehearsed intervals, hand signals, and fixed arcs. Units that had practiced the sequence in shipboard mock-ups and beach rehearsals executed the order with the timing necessary to make the shotgun sweep decisive. Where rehearsal had been minimal, the tactic misfired literally and operationally. Logistics and ordnance choices shaped the decisive waveform of these actions. Short-barreled trench patterns fitted with ventilated handguards and shortened stocks were preferred for maneuverability inside apertures. Commanders who wanted reliable performance insisted on brass-cased military buckshot loads rather than paper-hull commercial shells, which swelled in humidity and risked jamming. Quartermaster adjustments that provisioned assault waves with modest allotments of brass-cased buckshot therefore had an outsized effect. They converted a promising field expedient into a repeatable tactical instrument. Units that lacked reliable buckshot or that conserved rounds for later phases could not use the method reliably and therefore lost the tempo advantage the tactic afforded. At the decisive moments, the shotgun's effect was often immediate and visible. An aperture that had resisted rifle and grenade assault for minutes could be neutralized in seconds when the grenadier and shotgun man operated in concert. The collapse of one strongpoint created a cascading advantage as follow elements moved through the newly opened lane. Engineers and support weapons could then follow to clear obstacles and in place suppressive fires. The operational payoff was not merely the capture of a single revetment, it was the preservation of momentum that prevented the enemy from exploiting the beam of concentrated fire that otherwise built up at the approach. Opposition behavior then fed back into attacker decisions. Japanese defenders trained to expect engagements resolved at rifle ranges and machine gun arcs sometimes misread the new hazard. Interrogations and battlefield summaries preserved phrases that suggest surprise or disorientation at sudden multi-pellet wounds inside close apertures. That disorientation produced tactical options for attackers. A defender might abandon a slit trench and fall back to a secondary position rather than risk remaining in a now hazardous aperture. The decisive value lay in changing the defender's immediate cost-benefit calculation at the point of contact. Decisive actions also exposed the method's limits and costs. Ammunition expenditure in a single critical breach could be high. Assault waves that committed shotgun rounds early sometimes found themselves short during later consolidation tasks where additional close action occurred. Units that rationed buckshot for presumed decisive breaches sometimes misallocated their limited supplies. Commanders therefore developed simple decision rules to guide allocation use shotgun rounds for the initial breach of primary apertures or in known cave mouths. Conserve for follow phases when the geometry did not call for point-blank solutions. Those rules appear in after-action notes and training recommendations as practical heuristics rather than as prescriptive doctrine. Fratricide risk represented the primary tactical cost of the decisive sequence. A shotgun man operating without strict arc discipline or without synchronized timing could inflict casualties on adjacent friendly elements. The decisive edge vanished when the method's own effects produced unintended losses. In response, units emphasized arc assignment, verbal and hand signal discipline, and pre-assigned clear boundaries for the shotgun sweep. The decisive action therefore depended as much on restraint and procedural clarity as on the weapon's raw mechanical effect. Commanders also had to weigh the decisive short-term gain against longer logistic and strategic priorities. Devoting a significant fraction of assault allotments to buckshot reduced allocation to other munitions and to sustainment. Where a campaign involved prolonged inland fighting or required repeated clearances across many objectives, the cost per use of buckshot averaged higher. In those contexts, the shotgun remained a niche solution used judiciously. Where the operational objective demanded a rapid decisive beachhead, and where follow-on supply could be assured, commanders judged the trade-off favorable. Institutional learning accelerated after decisive episodes. Successful breaches that used the grenade-then-shotgun rhythm were recorded in company reports and then transmitted through training channels. Ordnance officers who observed reliability issues standardized short-barrel modifications and recommended brass-cased loads for assault waves. Quartermaster procedures incorporated modest allocations of buckshot for designated waves. Command manuals and regimental circulars in late 1944 reflect this aggregate learning. They do not demand universal shotgun use, but they recognize the tactic as an optional tool when confined geometry demanded fast clearance, and when supply lines allowed conservative provisioning. A decisive tactical act must be replicable to be strategically useful. The shotgun-based breach sequence passed the replicability test where three conditions aligned: confined geometry favorable to spread pattern lethality, rehearsal and arc discipline among assault elements, and sufficient logistical provisioning of reliable ammunition. When all three were present, the tactic reliably shortened breach times and preserved assault tempo. Where any condition failed, the result could be neutral or negative wasted rounds, fratricide, or insufficient effect. Case studies crystallized these observations without overselling them. On multiple islands, assault teams documented localized successes where the shotgun sweep finished a contested aperture and allowed follow elements to pass without heavy loss. In those cases, the decisive action produced observable tactical momentum. Yet campaign outcomes remained determined by broader factors: sea power, air superiority, logistics, and combined arms planning. The shotgun's decisive role was therefore granular. It changed the calculus at the aperture and thereby contributed to preserved tempo and reduced immediate losses in selected high-leverage moments. In the final accounting, the turning point at the tactical level was procedural, not technological. The shotgun's mechanical fit mattered, so did the logistical choices that made reliable loads available. But the decisive action came from codifying a simple, repeatable sequence and ensuring its disciplined execution under stress. That procedural crystallization is the true inflection. A field expedient became a tactical instrument because leaders learned to rehearse time intervals, assign arcs, and provision the rounds necessary to make the method reliable. Where those elements converged, the assault team gained a decisive edge inside the kill zone. Where they did not, conventional methods continued to govern outcomes. February 1942, the immediate aftermath of repeated shotgun employment in Pacific Island assaults was primarily tactical assault teams that integrated a disciplined grenade then shotgun entry sequence, often cleared apertures faster and with fewer immediate casualties than teams that relied on rifle fire alone. At Tarawa, in November 1943, several company after-action narratives attributed preserved beachhead momentum to the rapid collapse of key revetments once entry teams mastered timing and arc discipline. A cleared aperture allowed engineers and follow forces to advance before defenders could re-establish concentrated flank fires. These localized gains did not guarantee universal success at every point on the island, but they produced measurable improvements in breach time where the method was applied. Operationally, the shotgun's adoption generated three classes of downstream consequence: procedural change in small unit doctrine, logistical adjustments in ordnance provisioning, and a modest psychological effect on opposing defenders. Procedurally, units formalized entry sequencing for assault teams, briefing specific arc and timing rules for designated shotgun men as a standard element of pre-landing rehearsals. Over the remainder of 1943 and into 1944, those field practices were incorporated into regimental and divisional training notes and later reflected in assault circulars. The institutionalization was incremental, driven from the bottom up, and it increased the tactics' replicability across units that had trained the sequence. Logistics adjusted to doctrine. Quartermasters began including limited allotments of 12-gauge buckshot for designated assault waves. Ordnance shops standardized short barrel modifications and ventilated handguards to improve maneuverability and reduce barrel heating during repeated pumping. Commanders preferred brass-cased military loads where available because commercial paper hull shells swelled in humid tropical conditions and increased the risk of jamming. Those pragmatic ordnance choices converted an improvised field expedient into a more reliable tactical instrument where supply permitted. The shotgun's existing material lineage also accelerated uptake. Model 1897 and similar trench gun patterns already had a military pedigree and were present in transport and depot stocks, which reduced administrative friction and allowed commanders to test and adopt the weapon without waiting on long procurement cycles. That practical availability mattered. Units that could requisition and modify present stocks did so, while those lacking reliable shotguns or dependable loads could not employ the method consistently. Psychological and informational consequences were tangible but bounded. Interrogations and battlefield summaries recorded instances in which Japanese defenders described surprise or disorientation when confronted by sudden multi-pellet wounds at close range. In several episodes, defenders abandoned primary apertures and withdrew to prepared secondary positions rather than stubbornly holding a now hazardous slit trench. Those effects changed short-term decision cycles at the point of contact, occasionally reducing the number of protracted close combats that eroded attacker momentum. The psychological variable, however, remained a local tactical factor rather than a strategic force. Costs and constraints tempered broader adoption. Ammunition expenditure for a single decisive breach could be high, and repeated use across many objectives increased resupply burdens. Units that overcommitted buckshot early sometimes found themselves short during later consolidation phases. Maintenance demands were significant. Tropical salt air accelerated wear on wooden stocks and metal parts, and paper hull shells proved unreliable without brass alternatives. To manage these costs, commanders developed allocation heuristics, reserve shotgun rounds for initial breaches of primary apertures and known confined geometries, and conserve them for inland phases where longer-range weapons and sustained suppression remained the primary means of engagement. Doctrinally, the shotgun settled into a niche role. By late 1944, Marine and Army manuals and divisional circulars recognized the shotgun as an optional asset for confined clearing tasks, but did not elevate it to primary assault arm. The major determinants of campaign success continued to be naval gunfire, air superiority, combined arms coordination, and logistics. The shotgun's value was granular. It improved small unit breach outcomes and helped preserve tempo in selected high-leverage instances. Where those granular gains accumulated across multiple openings during a landing, they contributed to operational benefits, but they did not substitute for strategic firepower. On the battlefield, the aggregation of small advantages mattered. A landing that sustained momentum through its first hours reduced casualty exposure for follow waves and avoided the cumulative buildup of concentrated defensive fire on approach lanes. In operations where reconnaissance, accurate naval gunfire, and smoke and suppression were effective, the shotgun's role was complementary. In operations where other elements lagged, the shotgun sometimes filled a tactical gap that helped preserve overall tempo. Historical records show multiple such cases, though careful scholarship cautions against assigning the shotgun causal primacy in campaign outcomes. The aftermath also provoked limited professional discussion about weapon effects. The shotgun's multi-pellet wound pattern drew attention in medical and ordnance correspondence, reviving debates about wounding patterns first raised in earlier conflicts. Those discussions did not produce formal prohibitions within the U.S. military during the Pacific campaigns, but they contributed to cautious employment practices and to a preference for mission-driven limited use of buckshot rather than indiscriminate application. Longer-term legacy. The shotgun's combat use in the Pacific informed later clearing doctrine and influenced post-war close-quarters training. Lessons about matching weapon effects to geometry, rehearsing entry timing, and provisioning reliable munitions carried forward into urban and bunker clearing techniques developed after the war. As automatic weapons doctrine advanced and specialty breaching tools matured, the shotgun's prominence declined. Nevertheless, the Pacific experience survives in small arms history as a case study in how matching a specific tool to a narrowly defined tactical problem can yield outsized operational dividends. In short, the aftermath of shotgun employment was mixed but concrete. The weapon did not remap operational strategy. It improved the micro-practice of assault where geometry and tempo made the difference between a stalled beachhead and a mobile advance. Doctrinal uptake was cautious and conditional. Logistical and ethical constraints limited ubiquity. The enduring lesson is procedural when commanders matched weapon effect to confined geometry. Rehearsed the timing and arcs and provisioned reliable ammunition, the shotgun could reliably reduce exposure time for assault teams and preserve the initiative at critical breach points. Scholarly assessments of the 12-gauge shotgun's role in Pacific Island warfare converge on a few measured conclusions and leave several narrower debates open. 3 points of consensus are clear. First, the shotgun functioned as a pragmatic niche solution for specific close-quarters problems. It improved the odds of rapid incapacitation inside doorways, bunk ports, and cave mouths without becoming a general replacement for rifles or automatic weapons. Second, its adoption followed a bottom-up pattern. Tactical improvisation in the line produced repeatable procedures that training cadres later formalized rather than a single top-down doctrinal fiat. Third, its operational value was contextual, dependent on geometry rehearsal and reliable ammunition, so that success in one island or unit does not automatically translate into universal efficacy elsewhere. Scholars still contest two primary questions. The first contest concerns quantification. How much did shotgun employment actually reduce casualty rates or breach times when set against the noise of wartime reporting? Estimates vary because after-action data are uneven and because reporting standards differed across units. The second contested issue is interpretation. Should the shotgun be read as an example of tactical ingenuity with limited systemic impact, or as a case study that reorients how historians weigh micro-scale technologies in campaign outcomes? Reasonable historians answer differently depending on whether they privilege aggregate logistics and firepower or the accumulation of small tactical efficiencies. Military legacy is practical and procedural. The campaign reinforced several enduring lessons: match weapon effects to geometry, rehearse timing and arcs rigorously, and provision reliable munitions suited to the environment. These lessons found their way into post-war close quarters and urban clearing curricula. They also influenced ordnance thinking about modular short-range kits and the value of dedicated breaching tools. As automatic weapons rates of fire and specialty breaching technologies matured, the shotgun receded as a primary assault implement, but its Pacific use persisted as a training case in doctrine about combined entry teams. Operationally, the shotgun illustrates a broader principle about innovation in war tools: matter when coupled to disciplined procedures and supply. The weapon's mechanical attributes were necessary but not sufficient. The decisive element was procedural crystallization, simple sequences that soldiers could execute under stress. That procedural turn explains why the shotgun produced reliable local effects where it did and why it failed where rehearsal or reliable loads were absent. Culturally and ethically, the shotgun's use renewed professional conversations about wounding patterns and the appearance of injuries in medical and staff correspondence. Those conversations did not produce new legal prohibition in the US campaign context, but they contributed to norms of restrained mission-driven employment rather than indiscriminate use. Two brief historiographical recommendations for researchers prioritize unit-level after-action reports and ordnance logs to quantify effects and pair those documents with oral history testimony to capture the psychological variable recorded by contemporaries. These paired sources best reveal how mechanical affect human practice and supply constraints combined in concrete engagements. One-sentence conclusion and call to action. The 12-gauge shotgun was not a war-making technology, but a high-value tactical instrument that, when matched to confined geometry and disciplined procedure, shortened breach times and preserved assault tempo. Consult the unit reports and ordnance logs listed in the episode bibliography to test these claims further.